As I said, my name is J Spitzer. I'm my PhD, so I'm Dr. Danny. So you all came here to talk about faith and science, but I am going to start off by not talking about either of those. I'm going to talk about Houston sports. So how many of you are fans of either the Texans, Rockets, or Astros? Show of hands. Here we go. Okay. So of those who are fans of the Astros, raise your hand. So we're going to keep doing show of hands. We're going to see how much of a fan you are, how much you love the Astros. So first question about the Astros. How many of you know the current ranking in the AL West? Raise a hand. Okay, shout it out. First. That's right. They are in first place. So, how many of you know their current record? Raise their hand. Anybody other than this guy over here? Oh, we got one here? 56-49. Did you just look it up? Okay. It is 66-39. Okay. So this evening they're playing the St. Louis Cardinals. Does anyone know who the pitcher for tonight's game is? No. Who said that? It is Garrett Cole.
I said that.
Okay. So the couple of you that knew that it was Garrett Cole, do any of you know what his ERA is? Are you cheating in the back? Okay. It's very close. So he guessed that it was 3. It's 3.02.
Rounding.
Good job. So the point of this is to say, like, all of you raised your hands, or a very large amount of you said, I love the Astros, but you didn't know these itty-bitty facts because you don't spend all day, every day, like, looking up facts, learning about what they're doing, the trades they're making, their different stats. But the people that do are people that are super passionate about the Astros, that just want to know more. They want to know every little thing about this franchise, the players, the team. And so I wanted to make this distinction between being a fan, liking it being in your life, and it being a passion, something you love. Because for the majority of my life, the biggest passion, the only real passion I had was for science. I love science. I love to learn everything I possibly can. And so when I was a little kid, I was a normal kid. I would play with toys, I would play outside, I would play video games. But we had, how many of you have seen, like, when you're picking out paint swatches and you have, like, a little fan of all the different paint colors? So we had something like that, but it was trivia. It was science trivia, and it had all the different questions, and I would beg my parents. I was like, please ask me more questions, I just want to know more. And then I went to school, and I was not too overambitious. I didn't do, like, extra credit or things like that. But if there was a topic I liked, if one of my science teachers told me something, I was like, well, how does that work? I need to go look it up. I would go to my library, I would read books, I would go on the internet, I would read more. I just needed to know more. And because of this love for science, I actually went to 11 years of college. In those 11 years, I've written 3 papers, including one where I got the cover of Biopolymers magazine. And in those 11 years of school, I got 2 degrees. So I got my undergraduate in microbiology with a minor in math. And then I got my PhD, as they said, in structural and computational biology and molecular biophysics. So it's a tongue twister. And so, as I said, the majority of my life, that was my passion. That was what I spent so much of my time on. I just wanted to know more. And then around halfway through my undergraduate degree, I finally had something else that I cared that much about. And that was the Catholic Church. I found the Catholic Church. So, as they also said, I'm a cradle Catholic. So it's not that I had never heard of the Catholic Church before. I was actually very involved. I was the president of my youth group. But I knew God. I had a relationship with Jesus. I knew he loved me. I loved him. But I didn't know the church. I didn't know its teachings. I didn't know the beauty of everything that it's had, the 2,000 years of the Catholic Church, the thousands of years before that with the Hebrew religion. And halfway through college, I found it and I was like, I need to know more. Because it was the exact same thing in science, that it was this truth. It was this hard, factual truth, just like in science, and you could just sit there and read books and learn about all of this stuff. And so I wanted to know more. I wanted to know about this truth and this intellectual growth that the Catholic Church had. And so just like with science, I read every book I possibly could. I looked on the internet and I watched videos and I just soaked it all in. And what I found is that this beauty of the Catholic Church has a history for the entirety of it being a thing of loving knowledge and loving the truth. And so a couple hundred years ago, there was the Dominicans. They were the first order that had an academic mission, that their mission was to teach. They had this joy of intellect. And so because of this, many of the European universities that we have that date back more than 100 years are probably founded by the Dominicans. They were started by the Catholic Church, including the University of Paris. And then a couple of hundred years after that, we had the Jesuits. And so the Jesuits are not only the mission of evangelization and going out and teaching and educating people, giving them this intellectual beauty, but they specifically work in education and scientific research a lot of the time. So they have already this love of science. And now, because they work in education, they have a much longer process for school, a lot like I did, so I relate to the Jesuits. And so because of this history, this love of truth, this love of knowledge, throughout the years, there's never really been this discrepancy between faith and knowledge, faith and truth, faith and science. And so throughout the years, there's been so many great Catholic scientists. And so I'm going to go through a couple of the older ones that you might have heard about and then some newer ones that are still there on today, because this is still such a beautiful marriage between these two things. So first we have Catholic scientists. Yay. So first we have Gregor Mendel. So if any of you have ever heard anything about genetics, you know that he was the father of genetics. That him and his little pea plant, he figured out about genetic traits. But he was also a Belgian monk. And he loved his priesthood. He loved to be able to do the homilies, but he also had this passion for science. He was a lot like me. He had faith for science, or a passion for faith and a passion for science. So in his homilies, he would sneak in little analogies about his pea plants, and I'm sure his congregation got tired about hearing about these pea plants because he would work them into his homilies, and he saw that these two things could go together. And then you have Louis Pasteur. So he invented the pasteurization process, and he's called the father of microbiology. And he has one of my favorite stories. So at this time, he was super famous. He had come out with the pasteurization process, and he was riding a train. And on this train, he was praying a rosary. And so that's very outward side. People see it. They're like, oh, Catholic person. And this guy walked up to him and started making fun of him. And he was like, oh, you must not be very smart praying to that random guy up in the sky. Well, I'm just giving him the hardest time. And all he did is he stood up. He said, hi, I'm Louis Pasteur. And the guy's face just dropped. He's like, oh, crap. This guy is really smart. He must know something I don't. And so these are two really big names from the past, but they're kind of old. They didn't know the things we know now. So what about now that we know more about science? Are there still Catholic scientists? So next we have Jerome Lejeune, who was the person who discovered the third chromosome for Down syndrome. And he relentlessly, throughout his life, fought for the human rights of people with Down syndrome. That he understood the Catholic teaching of the dignity of a human person. And so even though he had this science and he had this career, he actually got blacklisted because he was so in favor of human rights. And he spoke so passionately about it. But he died in 1993, so who are some scientists that are still alive? I've had the honor of meeting a couple of these guys, and they're amazing. So the first one is Father Nicanor Asiago. So he is this guy here. He's so fascinating. He got his doctorate from MIT, and he currently works at the University of Providence in Rhode Island. And he works with genetics. He works on the CRISPR project, and so he looks into genetic engineering. And he is actually one of the leading people in the world when it comes to bioethics. He gets invited all around the country when people are discussing their laws and what is ethical when it comes to genetic engineering and looking at genes. But he's also, I'm going to get this wrong. He's some kind of monk. Oh, what is it? Oh, I'm going to forget it. I'm so sorry. It's OP. What's OP? Does anyone know? What? It's Dominican? Okay, so he's a Dominican priest. I'm so sorry, Father Nick now. But he is one of the smartest people I've ever seen. I just heard him talk back in June, and so you know people that are super smart on like one topic, but people are asking him questions on every topic, and he knew buckets about these topics. He knew so much, and I was just in awe. And then we have Dr. Stephen Bart. So he is in astrophysics, and he is at the University of Delaware. So he is not a priest, but he's a wonderful, wonderful Catholic man, and he loves so much the marriage between Catholicism and science that he actually started the Society of Catholic Scientists. And there are over 1,000 people that have joined in the last 3 years since it started because they know that having faith and loving science go together so well. And then finally we have Father Robert J Spitzer. Now he has written so many books. If you ever want to know anything about faith and science, read one of his books. He's amazing. He just came out with one, I'm not going to remember, New Proofs for the Existence of God, New Scientific Proofs for the Existence of God, something like that. But anyways, he's in charge of the Magis Center. And his whole job is to put out information about how faith and science go together. He has a whole website, he has a whole center, he has all these books. He wants the world to know that faith and science go together. And so, at this point I've talked about a lot of Catholic scientists, and the one that always gets brought up, that I haven't brought up, they're like, Danny, what about Galileo? He's the one that everyone asks about. It's like, oh, the Catholic Church hates science because of Galileo. But this is a huge misunderstanding. So I'm going to walk you through the story because it makes me laugh a lot because people are broken, which is, I don't know why I think that's funny. So anyways, so Galileo at the time, so this is all during the Inquisition, and he was already pretty famous. He had found moons on Jupiter. He had written a couple other papers. People knew about him, knew that he was this scientific guru. And he had actually already put out papers on the universe, or the galaxy being heliocentric, that it was around the star, around the sun, and it wasn't around Earth. So he had already put out these papers. Copernicus had already put out these papers. This wasn't a new thing. But Galileo pulled a no-no, and something you don't do in the scientific world. He said, my word is fact. In the science, the way it works is you study something, you come up with what you found, somebody else does the exact same experiment, somebody else does the exact same experiment, you have to test it a dozen times, so many times, before the scientific community will accept it as fact. But he had such a big ego, he was so full of himself, he's like, nope, I did it, I know it's fact, believe me. And so he not only did that, but then he also went on to talk about how parts of the Bible should not be taken literally, which is true, but he should have read the room, because this is right around the time when Luther started speaking out and started tearing down pieces of the Catholic Bible. And so for you to speak out at that time and say, yeah, the Bible's not even real, parts of it you don't read literally, not the best time. So he ruffled a few feathers with his ego and his inability to read these social cues. And so we had this friend who is now saying, his name was Robert Bellarmine, he was a cardinal at the time. And so he's like, hey, Galileo, I'm your friend, and I know you have lots of connections in the Catholic Church, but you're upsetting some people with the way you're going about things. So come with me to Rome, we'll discuss stuff. So they, two of these marched over to Rome, and they filled out this form and came up with some sort of an agreement that Galileo was going to talk about his ideas as a theory, because that's what you do in science. So they agree, they write up this document, and then Galileo goes home. And then Pope Urban VIII calls him up, obviously not calling him up, there weren't phones back then, but he calls him up and says, hey Galileo, love what you're doing, love that you're talking about it as a theory, but if you could, in your next book, include my theory, because I'm a pretty smart guy, that'd be great. So talk about yours as the theory, but say there are other theories, including mine, which I think is pretty great. Well, Galileo, with his ego, said, okay, I'll put it in the book. So he put it in the book, but the way that he wrote it was very much like, here are these 3 theories. Here's mine, it's the right one, and then here's these other 2 that people came up with that are wrong. And so it didn't really go well with Pope Urban. That he is also a human, he has faults, so his own ego, and he got upset, and that is when Galileo got put on house arrest. And even still, when he was in house arrest, he was able to receive communion, he was still able to do his science, he just wasn't able to leave his home. So all of this was a huge misunderstanding because of a lot of giant egos, that these 2 men just could not see eye to eye, and it had nothing to do with the actual science. But I think this is ridiculous that this is what people point to when they say Catholicism and science don't go together. They're like, remember back hundreds of years ago when there was this discrepancy between these 2 guys? Yeah, so therefore the whole Catholic Church. No. And so when I started to come across this idea that faith and science don't go together, because I have looked at this stuff for years. I have read and I have read and I have learned all these things, and I have never once found any issue between the 2, ever. And so when I started to hear people talking about how faith and science don't go together, I was like, what? What are you talking about? And so I was like, why do people think that way? Because I started to learn a lot of people think that way. And I interviewed some of the youth in my church, and I interviewed the adult ministers at our whole deanery, almost all of them. So people that are in the church thought that faith and science don't go together. And I was like, what are we doing wrong? Why do so many people think that they don't go together? And so what I decided through my scientific examinations and studies and experiments is that it's because we don't talk about them together. How many of you have actually heard any scientific teachings taught at your church in a homily? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 out of this room of a couple hundred people. Yeah, it's never talked about in the same place. So you never hear science talked about at church. You don't hear church talked about outside of church. They're just separate. They're never brought together. And this is not how my brain works, because my brain is constantly going. It goes 1,000 miles an hour. And when I think about science, I automatically see parallels with our faith. And when I'm learning about and reading about our faith, I automatically see a parallel to science. So we're going to go through a couple of these ways that my brain works and the ways that I see the parallel between them. So if we're going to talk about science, I have to brag on myself and talk about my research. Oh, shoot. Just kidding. I have one more slide first. So I think it's silly because there's a whole psalm that says, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. So every single thing in this natural world is shouting out something about our God and our faith and how he loves us. So every little thing in nature, anytime you're studying science, can tell you something more about your God. So now I'm going to go through a couple of examples. So my research, I studied this lovely protein. It's called the Lac Repressor Protein. And what I really cared about is this pink and red part. And so the important thing to know is that when the protein is on the correct DNA, it is in this beautiful little helix, that little red part. It's perfect. It's a perfect little spiral. But if it's on any other DNA, or if it's out in solution far away from DNA, it looks like this. It looks like a wet piece of spaghetti. It has no shape whatsoever. It definitely does not look like a helix. And nobody really knows why. And there's so many studies on this protein, but not on this little piece. So I was like, I'm going to learn about that little piece. And so what I found is that, okay, so here's a graph. It's very complicated. But what you need to know is that on the left is when it is out in solution, when it is far away from the DNA, it takes 60 kcal per mole to go from the squiggly to the helix. It takes 60 kcal per mole, which for those of you that don't know, in order for it to make it on its own and have no other effect, it should be about 2. So it's not 2, it's 60. Like it will never, ever, 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 ever do this on its own, ever. But once you start getting closer to DNA, closer to the solution that's that kind of a thing, it's only about 8. it drops way down once you get close to that DNA. And it's so much easier, and it just takes a little bit of extra energy to get it up that hill, go over that hump. And so what you come to find out is that we, all of us, and our souls, is my little molecule. And so God is that correct DNA, okay? And so the only time that we are perfect, the only time we're in our most perfect form, is we are completely in perfect union with Him in heaven. That's the only time. Every other time, we need some other source, we need some other energy to help us get to there. And when we are far away from Him, when we're nowhere near that DNA, not even the wrong DNA, it will never happen. We will never become that perfect form because we need God. We need to be close to Him. We need to be in union with Him. So this is my research, how my brain works. But we're going to go with one a little bit easier that's not as PhD level. So how many of you saw this picture this year? Yeah, it was a pretty big deal? So, okay. So for those of you that don't know, this is the first ever picture of a black hole. But it's not actually a picture of a black hole. So we'll get to that in a second. So what do we know of black holes? We know that they are really, really big. Really big. We know that we can't actually see the black hole. What you saw, that ring of light, is actually everything that's been sucked towards the black hole. It's all the stars and all the gas and everything that's being pulled into that black hole. But you can't actually see the black holes. Okay? Then you have an insane amount of gravity. That's why it's being pulled in. That's why all those things are coming towards it. It's because it just draws them in. It has this insane gravity. And then finally, we have no idea how time works in a black hole. We have theories, we have ideas, but we have no idea. So what does this make you think of when you think of these types of things? That it's big, you can't see it, that it draws things in, and that we don't understand time. God, yeah. So, okay. So it is bigger than all of us. It is bigger than our problems. We can't see Him, but we see the light of the church. We see the light of people that love Him, that are close to Him. He draws all of us into Him. And then I have 2 degrees. I have a PhD. I've been explained Kairos like a dozen times, and I still don't get it. I have no idea. It is weird. God's time makes no sense to me. And so we have a lot of people, but we're going to try really hard to do an activity. I'm going to get you guys to think like me. So I'm going to give you this left side. I'm going to tell you the stuff about some topic in science, and I want you to use your imagination and your creativity and come up with how it relates to faith. What is it about faith that's kind of a parallel to that thing? So we're going to walk through it ourselves. So someone observes something happening a certain way. They test it, and they see that it happens some more in that exact same way. Other people test it, and they also see that it happens in that specific way. And so it becomes a law so that everybody will know that it happens the same way every single time. What does that sound like? What? Anything else? 10 Commandments? Okay, so we have a couple ideas. We have that saints, that they figure out how to get to heaven, and so they do the same thing the same way. They all take that path to heaven. We have sacraments, that you have this one sacrament, and even though it happens all over the world, all these different people for years have done it, you do it in the same way. What I actually had in mind when I thought about it is that it's God's promise to us, that He promises again and again, and He always follows through. So that's that one. Since you guys were shy, that's okay. The next one is we have properties of light. So light is a wave, and it's also a particle, and it's both of those at the same time, even though they're very different. So who had this topic? Back, who wants to share? Talk loud. three different things, but they're all the same thing altogether. Okay? I also thought of the incarnation, that he's fully human and fully God, but he's both of them at the same time. What do we got next? The lever and a fulcrum. Physics 101. All right, Mr. Purple Shirt wants to share with us. Talk loud.
Red triangle and the blue squares, which is the weight. So as the fulcrum is closer to the weight, it's easier to lift the weight. So what we thought the blue square, aka the weight, is our struggles. Our struggles weigh us down, and the closer that the fulcrum, aka God, is to us, the easier it is to lift our problems off our shoulders.
Wonderful.
Oh, that was him. Yeah. Okay, so Stan.
Okay. Matthew, one of your GAC people, wants to tell you so.
So, stem cells, two different ways. The stem cells can be considered as us, and once they turn into something else, or we become a disciple of Christ by surrendering to God, we cannot go back on that. Like once we're baptized or confirmed, we can't go back on being a part of God.
You will always be a baptized Christian until the day you die.
Right.
Yeah.
And then.
And you had something else?
Yeah, we'll go. Let's see. I remember. I came up with that one. So yeah, you also can't undo the sacraments.
Yes.
Like any of the 7 sacraments. Once you do them, you can't go back on it in God's name.
Yeah. Very good. All right, give him this group around. Okay, we have one more. Who had geodes, these beautiful little rocks in the Bible? That guy right there really wants to tell me about geodes.
So, geodes, right? Okay, so we said that a geode is an individual person, and these stones are made inside of a volcano, and we said that volcano represents God, and these rocks are made from the heat of the volcano, and we're putting the heat of the volcano as God's love for us. In the inside, it's our spirit, how all of our spirits are different, they're not the same. And like the outside will represent like who we are on the outside, and once you get to meet us, you get to see our inside. You can see how beautiful the inside is.
Yeah. Okay, so this is how my brain thinks. That it puts these two together every second of every day when I see anything science or anything church. Because in my brain, I put the church and science together. But as I said, most of the world does not do that. Most of the world keeps church over here and science over here. And because of that, because that's been happening for hundreds of years, there become these big topics. There are big things that people are so divided on that they think that the church will never agree with science. And this is just dead wrong. This is so wrong. And so I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to cover 2 of these big topics. And so the very first one is what happened at the beginning of everything. How did it all begin? And so the current theory in science that has a lot of science behind it is called the Big Bang Theory, right? So 13.8 billion years ago, a very quick and large expansion happened, and it's been expanding ever since then. That expansion is called the Big Bang, and at this time was the very beginning of both space and time. So that means before that, there was no before that. There was no time, there was nothing. So the reason that I laugh when people say this doesn't go with the Catholic teaching is because the person that came up with this, so he was a Belgian monk. His name is Father George Lemaitre. And so in 1929, he came up with the idea, just purely based on theoretical calculations, that the universe was expanding. And because it was expanding, it must have had a beginning. There must have been some point where that expansion began. And this is what he came up with. And he actually called it the cosmic egg, and people making fun of him called it the Big Bang, and then that name just stuck. So at the time, when he first came up with it, Einstein here said, your calculations are correct, but your physics is atrocious. He did not like his findings. He did not agree with his findings. And I feel like this picture captures that awkwardness. That he just kind of badmouths him and Lemaitre's kind of like side-eyeing you. But then, 3 years after he came out with his first paper, a very famous scientist called Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble telescope is named after, he actually, so like I said, Lemaitre's findings were all theoretical. They were all just things he wrote down on a piece of paper. He didn't actually observe anything. He just came up with this idea. And Hubble, 3 years after he came out with that paper, actually had observations. He saw out in the sky that things were expanding, that the stars and the planets of the universe were actually expanding. And like in my head, I just have, again, back to this picture, that Lemaitre came back to me and was like, oh, my physics is atrocious, is it? And it's still this very awkward photo. But the idea behind the Big Bang Theory, so again, this was in the 30s, and so since then we have had so much more proof that this expansion is happening. We actually came up with the time of 13.8 billion years, because when they came up with it, they just knew there was a starting point. And so we have all these really complex things that have added to our knowledge. And so, as I said, this point, this Big Bang, was the beginning of time and space. So if there was a beginning of time and space, in order for that to start, you need a creator to be outside of time and space. And that's what we call God. We have this creator that is outside of time and space. Now, I have to, as a scientist, give a disclaimer that this is still just a theory, because we can't physically go back in time. But like I said, there's so much proof. So we know that it has been expanding for 13.8 billion years, but there's a couple other theories that have no actual scientific basis. It's people that were like Lemaitre, just, well, what if? Have you ever thought? But there's no actual proof of any of it. But one of those other ideas is that, yes, it's expanding now, but it's expanded before. So it expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And it's been doing this indefinitely, infinitely, for ever and ever. But based on science, based on proof, this could have happened, but it could have only happened 100 times, that expansion and contraction. And so there still is a beginning. There still is a beginning of space and time, and so you still need that creator outside of space and time. So even if the Big Bang doesn't hold, even if it doesn't stick around forever, we know that this expansion is happening, and we know that there's a beginning of space and time, based on scientific evidence. Okay, so that's the first topic. The second topic, the elephant in the room, the big science topic. Oh. So, okay, so I don't know how much is taught in your schools, but in this room we're talking about faith and science. So we need to talk about what the Bible and the Catholic Church teaches about the progression through time, and what science says, the progression through time. Unfortunately, I would say 98% of the population of the world is not really educated on both of those things. That they are only told what the media tells them or what they see in culture. And so we're going to take a second and we're going to look at what media and culture tells you about. So for the first one, for the biblical version of what most people know about what we teach about the progression of time, who has ever heard the song God Bless Texas?
Yeah.
Okay. I pardon, it was in the 90s, so it's bad graphics. Oh, wrong way. Okay, so other than the very 90s-ness of this, it gets a lot of things wrong. But that is what most people say. They're like, well, there was light, and then there was a moon, and There's some other stuff. But then we have the science side. So how media portrays what science thinks about since the beginning of time. How many of you have seen the show Big Bang Theory?
Yes.
Our universe was in a hot, dense state that nearly 14 million years ago expansion started. We began to cool the autotrophs, began to drool Neanderthals, developed tools, we built a wall, we built the pyramids. Math, science, history, around the mystery that all started with the Big Bang.
Okay, bring it back. So, as I said, both of these are wrong, or both of these leave out large amounts of the actual information. And so we're going to take a second, and I want to walk you through both of them side by side. Okay? So we have the Bible, and we've got science. And what does it actually say? So Bible, we've got day one, there was light and darkness. So what does science say about the very beginning? Like we said, 13.8 billion years ago, there was the Big Bang. So it was this massive expansion. There were all these, or a couple of different elements, but there was massive amounts of heat, so there was massive amounts of light. So in this darkness, in this nothingness, there was this big expansion, and light was brought into the universe. Then day two, there was the firmament and the heavens. What does science say? It says that shortly after the Big Bang, so 200,000 million years ago, stars were created. Those elements came together to create those stars. The stars were really hot, and so they started creating the new elements in that heat, and those they shot off those elements, and those elements combined back together to make more planets. And then a long time after that, 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was created. So it created the heavens, it created the firmament of these planets, it created all these things. Is the very next thing that it created. Then, day three, we have land and sea and plants. So once we have this the planet Earth 4.5 billion years ago, what happened? So we have this molten Earth, and it starts to cool. And when it starts to cool, these elements of hydrogen and oxygen come together, and they start to congregate. We have the molten Earth, and we have the seas, and they start to separate. Then, 3.5 billion years ago, we have the first single-celled things, and then plants started forming in the sea. They created green algae. Okay, so this is 3.5 billion years ago. Same order. Next, we have day 4. So on day 4, the days and the seasons. So this is a little hard to explain, but 1 billion years ago, we had our first photosynthesis. So we had that green algae, and it started producing oxygen. And so once it started producing oxygen, we got an ozone. That ozone created climate. So it started having different areas of the globe having different types of weather. And so we started having the seasons. So our Earth was actually going through these different seasons throughout the year because we had the ozone. Day 5, creatures of the water and air. So 600 million years ago, those single-celled creatures started to get a little bit more complex. They started having this aquatic life. And those plants, because there's the ozone, because there's oxygen in the atmosphere, started to go onto land due to that available oxygen. And then because they were on land, they were able to get the light from the sun and create even more oxygen, and then we had a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere. Then day 6, creatures of the land and man. So 400 million years ago, once we started having oxygen, those animals started coming onto the land. Those aquatic creatures started changing based on the different areas that they were. And then 2 million years ago is when we first had the first Homo species. We had Homo erectus and Homo sapien and all these other different genuses. But 300,000 years ago is when the first Homo sapien was. So none of this is to say what is the distinction of what is a man. But as for science and our scientific distinctions, this is when these sort of things happen, when their fossil records started appearing. So, why do people have such an issue between these two things? Because in my eyes, this is the exact same order. Everything happens in the exact same order. The only difference is that they're said in different types of language. That this is much more literary, this is much more factual, but it's the same thing. So why do people have an issue? And the reason people have an issue come down to 2 things. And so the first one is that in the Bible it says we are made in God's image. And people in their head cannot grasp the idea that if our physical bodies were to have evolved from other physical bodies, that somehow that makes us less special, that we are less important, and then we couldn't have been made in the image of God. But according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the image of God abides in the soul. And so at some point, God came down and he put human souls into those human beings. And that is how we are created in the image of God, that it makes us different than every other creature in the entire world, in the entire universe. And so, almost done. So, what does the Catholic Church actually teach about the beginning of time? Because people have these grand ideas, but as I said earlier, the Bible isn't always meant to be taken literally. So we come to these 2 points. There are 2 points you have to believe if you believe in the Catholic Church when it comes to this type of thing. The first one is that at some point God instantaneously put 2 human souls into 2 human beings, and that point started the human race. Okay? And then at some point, those same 2 human souls performed the original sin, causing the fall of humanity. That's it. It doesn't say you have to believe how those human forms came to be. It just says that those human souls, that specific thing, you have to believe that God instantaneously put them into a human person. Okay? So, at this point, that's all the time I have for the big topics. And so I really want to end on 2 points. So the first one is, if you take nothing away from this talk other than one thing, I want it to be that you have an open mind. That if you don't think that science and the Catholic faith go together, it's probably because you haven't looked hard enough. You haven't looked into that topic, because I've looked a lot, and I have never, ever found any discrepancy between the 2. And so I just ask you to have that open mind, to keep questioning, to keep asking questions. And then, because both of these sides, both religion and science, are searching for truth. They both want truth. The Catholic Church understands that science is a wonderful avenue for finding this truth, and they encourage it. They just want you to know that science only asks the questions of what and how, but religion asks who and why. They're both pursuing truth, but they're asking different questions of this world and of this universe. And so I want to close by letting you know that I do this full time. And so I have a lovely little website. And if you want to know more, I have videos about these bigger topics. I go more in depth about these bigger topics. But I also have blogs that are a lot like the activity that we did. And then I have some social media as well. But the point is that if you have these questions, shoot, I went one too far. But anyways, if you have questions, the answers are out there. You just have to know where to ask.
What's your TikTok?
I don't have a TikTok. I just have Instagram and Twitter. Sorry. I'm old. I'm 28. I don't have TikTok.